I smoke 2 joints when I wake up. In the car I smoke 2 joints. I smoke 2 joints when I play video games. And every 10,000 points I smoke 2 joints in time of peace and 2 in time of war. I smoke 2 joints before I smoke 2 joints, and then I smoke 2 more.
Alright, back at it with the only free MMA channel that fucking matters, and this was requested by my boy Joey Davis. He said, hey, could you do Kelvin Gastelum versus the world at 185 and 170? I sure will, I got you. So how we're going to do this is we're going to do a little bit of the knowledge on Kelvin Gastelum's history, then we're going to go into what I think, how I think he would do against the 1 through 15 in welterweight and middleweight. So let's get to it. First of all, Kelvin Gastelum is 13-2. He's lost twice in the UFC, and he came into the UFC, I believe, from the Ultimate Fighter. Yeah, he got into the UFC from the Ultimate Fighter. His official he went 4-0 on the Ultimate Fighter, and his official first fight in the UFC was against Uriah Hall at the Ultimate Fighter finale. He won that fight versus Uriah Hall via split decision in 2013. That was his first fight in the UFC. After that, he fought Brian McCullone, and he got a submission. Now, I don't know who Brian Melankin is, so I'll get into that in a second. Then he fought Rick Story, third fight in the UFC. Rick Story, another win, another split decision though. So at that point, he had fought 2 high-level guys, in my opinion, Uriah Hall and Rick Story, and they were both split decisions. So at that point, to me, he hadn't had a dominant win against a high-level opponent. Next, he fought Nicholas Muskoki, and that was another decision, unanimous decision. So that's 4-0 in the UFC, 5-0 in the UFC. Jake Ellenberger, submission. There's a finish of a high-level guy. I don't know if Jake Ellenberger was past his prime in 2014, but I think he was. Jake Ellenberger, he's definitely a win-lose guy, but a lot of people have Jake Ellenberger on their resume. Man on deck, but he gets beat a lot. Then, so that made him 4-0 in the UFC. Let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4. Jake Ellenberger was 5-0 in the UFC. Now, before the UFC, he was 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. He had 5 fights before the UFC. All 5 of those were finishes. So Kelvin Gastelum has 8 finishes out of 12 wins. 5 of those came before the UFC. So that takes it to out of 12 wins. So you take those 5 off, go down to 7. So 3 of those 7 have been finishes. So he's had 4 decision wins in the UFC, 3 finish wins in the UFC. But I will say, note that 5 of his finishes did come before the UFC. Alright, so he's 5-0 in the UFC, and he fights Tyron Woodley. And what I will say is he fought Uriah Hall at middleweight, and after he fought Uriah Hall, picked up W at middleweight, he said he wanted to move down to 170 because it was a controversial split decision, and he said he felt like Uriah Hall was just stronger than him, so he wanted to move down to 170. He moved down to 170, and he fought Brian Melkelin, Rick Story, Nick Muskoki, and Jake Ellenberger. He missed weight once at that point. I think it was against Nicholas Muskoki. He missed weight by 1 pound. But after, or maybe not. Yeah, I think so. So after that, anyways, he was 5-0 in the UFC, and he lost to Tyron Woodley. Tyron Woodley, he missed weight by 10 pounds. Kelvin Gastelum missed weight by 10 pounds in the Tyron Woodley fight. Tyron Woodley didn't know until the day of weigh-ins and still fought Kelvin Gastelum with a 10-pound weight disadvantage. Tyron Woodley beat Kelvin Gastelum even though Kelvin Gastelum was 10 pounds overweight. And he also gave Kelvin Gastelum his money back. He owed Tyron Woodley 30% of his fight purse for missing weight. Tyron Woodley beat him and gave him his money back. He said he was in enough trouble with the UFC for missing weight. So after that, Dana White told him he won't be able to fight at 170 again. So he goes up to 185 and fights Nate Marquardt, finishes Nate Marquardt. After that fight, he goes back down to 170. He said he'll make the weight. He fights Neil Magny. He lost to Neil Magny. So that was his second and only loss in the UFC, Kelvin Gastelum. He lost to Tyron Woodley and Neil Magny. They are both high-level guys. Tyron Woodley's one of the highest-level guys. Neil Magny's definitely a top 10 guy. It was also a split decision loss, though. He's had some split. versus Tyron Woodley, was also a split decision loss. So he's had a few split decisions in the UFC. Against pretty much all of the high-level guys he fought, he had split decisions except for Jake Ellenberger and Nate Marquardt. So then after that, he goes up to he fight Johnny Hendricks at UFC 200. He fights Johnny Hendricks, and he beat Johnny Hendricks at UFC 200, and so he got scheduled for UFC 205. After Kelvin Gastelum beat Johnny Hendricks at UFC 200, he was scheduled to fight Donald Cerrone at UFC 205. Kelvin Gastelum missed weight for the third time at that point and was pulled from his fight with Donald Cerrone. At that point, Dana White said he'll never fight at 170 again, so he was at UFC 206. He was scheduled to fight Tim Kennedy. Tim Kennedy he finished in the third round at 185. After that, he fought Vitor Belfort at 185 and also finished Vitor Belfort. The fight was overturned into a no contest because Kelvin Gastelum was popped for marijuana in his system during the fight. So that was overturned. So Kelvin Gastelum's 13-2. My assessment is, against all the high level, this is my thing on Kelvin Gastelum. His last wins were against Vitor Belfort, Tim Kennedy, and Johnny Hendricks. All of those guys were past their prime. He did finish Vitor and Tim Kennedy, but they're both past their prime. Johnny Hendricks' decision. He was at 170 at that point, and he wasn't looking good at that point. So he beat three guys that were sort of past their prime as far as his most recent wins. He lost to Neil Magny. He beat Nate Marquardt, who was also past his prime at that point. He lost to Tyron Woodley with a 10-pound weight advantage. Now that's not a good look. And before that, he was undefeated with this biggest win being Jake Ellenberger. So and now this is what I think of Kelvin Gastelum as a fighter. I believe he is a top, if he can make the weight at 170, I'll say he is a top 10, top 15 welterweight. I do not think he's a top 5 welterweight. I don't think he can beat anybody in the top 5 at welterweight off the top of my head, unless there's anyone up there that's past their prime. Now, same in middleweight. In middleweight, I think he's probably a little lower ranked because he felt like Uriah Hall was too strong for him at middleweight. So the guys like Chris Weidman, Gegard Mousasi, Yoel Romero, Luke Rockhold, they're all going to be way too strong for him at middleweight as well. At middleweight, he's only beat guys that are past their prime besides Uriah Hall. So I don't think he can contend with the top 5, top 10 guys at middleweight, and I don't think he can contend with the top 5 guys at welterweight. Now, let's get into versus the world. We'll do middleweight first because I don't know what I don't know. We'll just do welterweight first because it's a smaller division. Tyron Woodley, the champion. Tyron Woodley would definitely beat Kelvin Gastelum. Tyron Woodley has beat Kelvin Gastelum with a 10-pound weight disadvantage. Damian Maia, I think he's also would be too big. He would, I think, because Damian Maia has fought at middleweight too. So is Kelvin Gastelum. They're both middleweights that could fight at 170. But Damian Maia is probably, just a little more professional, so he actually makes the weight. But they're about the same size, so I don't know. I would give that to Damian Maia, even though Damian Maia is still getting wins. Some people might say, Kelvin Gastelum beats guys that are past their prime. So he would have a chance. That would be an even matchup fight because Kelvin Gastelum beats guys that are at this age. So maybe a couple years ago, definitely Damian Maia. Today, Kelvin Gastelum has a chance. Stephen Thompson. I would pick Stephen Thompson for sure. I don't think Kelvin Gastelum would go in there and have what it takes to be okay with a boring fight. Stephen Thompson would wait on Kelvin to come in, and Kelvin's not a specialist in any one area. So anytime, I definitely believe Stephen Thompson could get the job done, because if Kelvin comes in, I don't know. I just definitely, Stephen Thompson, he doesn't have wrestling as good as Tyron Woodley. He doesn't have the power of like a Tyron Woodley, so Stephen Thompson doesn't have to worry about the same things he had to worry about with Tyron Woodley. And Stephen Thompson is one of the best welterweights in the world right now, so I definitely would. And he's not past his prime, so I would pick Stephen Thompson. Robbie Lawler, I don't believe he's past his prime. I would definitely pick Robbie Lawler. Robbie Lawler's at the edge of his prime, right toward the end of his prime. in 1 year come back and Kelvin Gastelum might get the W. But if they fought today, I would pick Robbie Lawler. Jorge Masvidal, I would pick Jorge Masvidal. I think he would actually tear Kelvin Gastelum up with the fucking boxing, or just with the striking. I don't think Kelvin is a big guy like Damian Maia, but I don't think Kelvin's jiu-jitsu is near as good as Damian Maia's to be able to control Jorge Masvidal enough to hang on him. So I would definitely pick Jorge Masvidal. Neil Magny has already beaten Kelvin Gastelum. It was a split decision, but I would give it to Neil Magny. Carlos Condit. Hey, they moved Carlos Condit down to number 6. Okay. Okay, they still have him on the rankings, though. I would pick Carlos Condit. I don't think he's past his prime. So I would pick Carlos Condit because I feel like Kelvin Gastelum beats... Carlos Condit's one of the best fighters in welterweight, and I don't feel like Kelvin Gastelum really beats the best fighters at welterweight except for the guys that are past their prime. So I would not pick him versus Carlos Condit. Okay, so Stun Gun Kim. I would pick Kelvin Gastelum to beat Stun Gun Kim. And now the Carlos Condit fight, I kind of want to give put some respect on Kelvin's name and give him a chance, but I would edge Carlos Condit out to win that fight. Yeah, I would pick Carlos Condit in that fight. Damn, I don't know. I would be. Kelvin might be able to beat Carlos Condit. I don't know. I would just pick Carlos off the top of my head right now. I would pick Carlos. I don't know though. Carlos retired. I don't know where his head's at. I would watch the fight. That would be an interesting fight. Dong Young Kim, yes, I would pick Kelvin. Donald Cerrone, ooh, at welterweight. Donald Cerrone at welterweight. Damn. This would be a good fight. Damn. I almost want to say I'd pick Kelvin. He would definitely have a little bit of size on Donald Cerrone. But Donald Cerrone, no, I would pick Donald Cerrone. I got to pick Cowboy. He's got, I don't, ooh, damn. That's a hard one to pick. This is Kelvin Gastelum versus the world, so we're fucking picking Kelvin. Fuck your time, mad dude. He's got a little bit of size on Donald Cerrone. I don't know, man. I don't know. This one's a really hard one. I would like to pick Donald Cerrone here. I could easily see him clipping Kelvin up. He's also a black belt in jiu-jitsu, I believe. It's hard to pick here. Kelvin, well, no, I'm going to pick Donald Cerrone here because I feel like Kelvin is, when I look at his resume and do the research, I feel like he's beating the guys that are past their prime or the guys that are not at the top of the division. And Donald Cerrone is not past his prime, and he is sort of at the top of the division. So I would pick Donald Cerrone. Gunnar Nelson, ooh, I would pick Kelvin Gastelum, man. I would. Yeah. That one, it's kind of like the Damian Maia fight a little bit, but just to a little lesser extent. Yeah, I would pick Kelvin Gastelum over Gunnar Nelson. Kamaru Usman, Tarek Safadine, Ryan LaFair, Santiago Puzimbimbo, Leon Edwards, and Matt Brown. I would pick Kelvin Gastelum over all of these guys. So I guess at welterweight, you could say I would have Kelvin Gastelum right above Gunnar Nelson. So at number 8. I think everyone in the top 8 of welterweight minus Stun Gun Kim could beat Kelvin Gastelum, and everyone under would lose to Kelvin Gastelum. So I have Kelvin Gastelum in the top 10 at welterweight in my head, but not the top 5. Now let's go to middleweight. We have the champion Michael Bisping. I would pick Michael Bisping. Fuck what you're talking about. Yeah, you're like, whoa, I didn't expect that. No, I would pick Michael Bisping. That's the motherfucking champion. He's top 5 middleweight. You're crazy. He's not past his prime, and he's also one of the top 10 middleweights. So I would pick Michael Bisping. Yep, I got Michael Bisping versus Kelvin Gastelum. Yoel Romero, I got Yoel. Luke Rockhold, I got Yoel. I said Yoel. I got, the top 5 is going to be pretty easy for me. Just because Kelvin Gastelum said Uriah Hall was too strong for him at middleweight. So a lot of these guys are just stronger than Uriah Hall, better wrestlers than Uriah Hall. So I don't think Kelvin Gastelum really is a contender at middleweight as far as beating the guys that are still in their prime. Now the guys like Vitor Belfort, Nate Marquardt, or I mean, who else? Who else did he just beat? Not Nate Marquardt. Vitor Belfort, yeah, Nate Marquardt, Anderson Silva, Uriah Hall, Sam Alvey, Daniel Kelly. Kelvin Gastelum has a chance against those guys. But now, number 1, Yoel Romero. Number 2, Luke Rockhold. Number 3, Robert Whitaker. Number 4, Gegard Mousasi. Number 5, Jacare. We'll stop at 4. So 1 through 4, Kelvin Gastelum, I do not see beating. Jacare, I do not see Kelvin Gastelum beating either. He's not as big as Robert Whitaker. He's not going to be able to stifle Jacare as well, I don't think. Maybe in 1 year, Kelvin will be able to beat Jacare, but right now, I'm just not going to give him the win over Jacare. Chris Weidman versus Kelvin Gastelum. I would pick Chris Weidman because I think Chris Weidman is definitely stronger than Uriah Hall. Chris Weidman, I think, could control Kelvin Gastelum. Anderson Silva. If they were in Brazil, I'd pick Silva. Like if it was going to a decision and they'd give him the win. But I'd see Kelvin Gastelum definitely beating Anderson Silva right now. I think he could do it. Anderson Silva could win though. He could win, but that's the GOAT. You got to give him some respect. But he's past his prime, and so Kelvin Gastelum beats guys that are past their prime. I got Kelvin. Derek Brunson. I definitely got Derek Brunson. I would like to watch that fight. You wanna be a middle, so you wanna be a middleweight, huh? Here's a middleweight for you that's in the top 10, a real middleweight that's not past his prime, Derek Brunson. I would pick Derek Brunson, though. David Branch, I don't know much about. I believe he came from World Series of Fighting. He had one fight in the UFC. Did he win that fight? If so, it was like a comeback. But I would pick David Branch over Kelvin Gastelum because David Branch is not past his prime. It would be a good fight, though. It would be interesting. Krzysztof Jotko, I don't know much about, but he's not past his prime, and he's in middleweight top 10, so that would be a pick'em for me. But I would probably give it to Jotko. Vitor Belfort, Talis Leitis, Uriah Hall. I would pick Kelvin versus all these guys, Sam Alvey and Daniel Kelly. Yeah, I would actually pick Kelvin Gastelum versus these guys. He could easily lose one of those fights. So I've got top 10 in between top 5 and top 10 at welterweight, and in between top 10 and top 15 at middleweight. Yeah, man, so that's where I think he's at right now. I am interested to see him fight somebody like Derek Brunson or Chris Weidman or Jacare, one of these top middleweight contenders that you would not put on in the Legends League. Because as of right now, he fought Vitor Belfort, Tim Kennedy, and Johnny Hendricks in his last 3 fights. All of those guys, I would say, are past their prime. So I want to see him fight a young guy. He's not going to be fighting at welterweight anytime soon, most likely. So, yeah, I want to see actually Kelvin Gastelum versus Chris Weidman or versus Derek Brunson. And he is scheduled to fight Chris Weidman soon, so we'll see how that goes, man. I actually think Chris Weidman is going to get that W. So, yeah, I don't know what else to say on this, man. It is what it is. Fuck it. Let the hitters know what you think in the comments.